Good morning. I would like to welcome everybody to the Virginia Transit Association's webinar, Virginia Transit on the Lookout to Fight Human Trafficking. I'm Danny Plauger, Director of Policy for VTA. I'm glad that you can join us and participate from wherever you are working during this time of social distancing. Lisa sends her regrets for not being able to join us today. She's dealing with a family medical emergency, and we wish her the best. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website along with the slides for on-demand viewing in the future. Next slide, please, Annie. We will save all questions for the Q&A portion of the webinar after all the panelists have presented. We will, of course, encourage you to send your questions anytime during the presentation. Here's how to do that. Look for the webinar panel on your screen and simply type your question into the question box. And although they will be answered at the end of the webinar, you can submit your question at any time and we'll hold on to them for the Q&A portion. Remember that the audience is muted, so we will be unable to hear you during the webinar. Next slide. Our presenter today is Annie Sovic. Annie is Director of Busing on the Lookout, a program of Truckers Against Trafficking. As BOTL's director, Annie is responsible for leading TAT's engagement with the bus industry, motor coach, transit, and school bus. Annie came to TAT in 2018 with over 12 years' experience as a human rights lawyer, working on anti-human trafficking, anti-torture, and refugee protection policies at the national and international levels. Prior to joining TAT, Annie was director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Center of Victims of Torture. She's a graduate of the University of New Mexico School of Law and received her BA in International Studies from the University of Denver. And with that, it's my pleasure to now turn the webinar over to Annie. Thank you very much.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much to the Virginia Transit Association for hosting this session, and thanks to all of you for joining this webinar today. I do want to start by recognizing that we're going through a particularly challenging time in the world right now, and I know that the impact of COVID-19 is weighing heavily on transit providers in cities and towns throughout Virginia and the rest of the United States, with both reduced ridership and routes, along with increased risk for those who are running essential routes. And so just please know that we at Truckers Against Trafficking are sincerely grateful for the service that you and your drivers are providing every day. And an extra special thanks to those who are still out on the road helping to ensure that industries that are essential to basic health and well-being can continue to function by providing much needed transportation. With that being said, I want to turn our attention to another difficult topic, human trafficking, but rather than feeling overwhelmed or discouraged by the darkness of this subject, I hope that at the end of this webinar, you will feel not only educated about what human trafficking is, what it looks like, where there may be intersections with transit, but I also hope that you feel empowered and equipped to know what steps you can take to help fight this heinous crime in the course of your everyday jobs. So just again, to reintroduce myself, I am Annie Sovic. I'm the Director for Busing on the Lookout, or BOTL, as we call it for short. BOTL is a program of Truckers Against Trafficking, or TAT, as we like to say. TAT has been working with the trucking industry since 2009, but we just launched our bus training program in early 2018. And in these past 2+ years, I have been so inspired by the way in which all segments of the bus industry, that's motor coach, transit, school, have embraced the BOTL training program, and how decision makers in all segments have taken steps to make sure that all of their employees are informed about human trafficking and empowered to report it effectively. So let's just start with this question of what is human trafficking? So what are some words or examples that come to mind when I say human trafficking? I'm going to pause for a second and just ask that you jot down a few thoughts on your own. So I'm guessing that several of you may have written down words like slavery, prostitution, force, exploitation, vulnerable children. If you did, you're on the right track. So human trafficking is the exploitation of human beings through force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of either commercial sex, so think prostitution, stripping, pornography, brothels, pimps, as well as forced labor or labor trafficking. So with that, think domestic servitude, construction, agricultural fields. Labor trafficking can occur in restaurants, hotels, motels, casinos, really any industry. This is workers not being paid for their labor or being held against their will or being forced to work long hours. And all of this is being driven by a trafficker, a victimizer, a person who is in control and is making a profit off of exploiting someone else's body or labor. Human trafficking is modern day slavery. And while many people would like to believe that slavery ended over 150 years ago, we know that is simply not true. In fact, there are over 40 million victims of modern day slavery worldwide, including thousands of girls, boys, women, and men here in the United States. It's the second largest criminal activity in the world, generating an estimated $150 billion in illicit profits globally. As traffickers prey upon vulnerabilities, they frequently target children, using their hopes, dreams, immaturities, fears, and disappointments as weapons to exploit their bodies for profit. And while all children can be susceptible to the forceful and manipulative methods that traffickers use, children who are in foster care, homeless, runaways, LGBTQ, or who come from abusive homes are particularly at risk. And the abuse they suffer can be excruciating. A victim of sex trafficking may be forced to have sex up to 20 times a day. And just let that soak in for a second. And really, that's a nice euphemism, isn't it? I mean, forced to have sex. That statistic really should read raped up to 20 times a day. Just because money exchanged hands does not make the sex consensual, not for an adult under pimp control, and certainly not for a child. In fact, according to the federal definition of sex trafficking, any minor involved in commercial sex is a victim of trafficking automatically. It doesn't matter if she's smiling or if he says he wants to be out there. That child needs an adult to stand up for them. Now, human trafficking is a global problem that's happening throughout the United States. And even as a global problem, the way to fight it is through local action, which is where you all come in. This map provides a visual representation of calls that have gone in to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So you can see that human trafficking has been reported in all 50 states, DC, and Virginia. Now, some of you, particularly being from Virginia, may recognize these two. This is Laura Sorensen and Alder Hudsa. These two made national news in January 2015 when they were arrested at a truck stop outside of Richmond. Now, officers were called to the scene that day to investigate a report of suspicious activity connected to their RV. The couple was friendly with the officers. They said they were on vacation to visit Sorensen's daughter. They talked about the trip and even allowed the officers into their RV to look around. At one point, one of them pointed toward a landmark they'd visited. And as everyone looked in the direction they were pointing, Trooper Stephanie McFall made eye contact with another young woman in the RV. And without saying a word, the young woman made a plea for help. When the officers took her aside, she began to weep, and she told them that she was being held against her will and had been abused sexually and physically by the suspects. She said the suspects threatened to kill or injure her family. She said she had infections all over her body and couldn't remember the last time she'd had anything to eat or drink. She told them that the suspects had branded her on her back and had inflicted burns on other parts of her body, along with lacerating her feet. And she said no one back at home in Iowa considered her missing, since the suspects forced her to communicate with family members regularly, telling them she was on a road trip, so they didn't have to worry. She later told a state police investigator that she had been forced to perform oral sex on Hodsa, the male suspect, and another unknown male that same day inside the RV at that Virginia truck stop. This encounter had been arranged through a Craigslist ad. Now, this is an example of what sex trafficking can look like in our country. There are several points of intersection between transit and human trafficking. In a study released last year by Polaris, who runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline, 42% of survivors stated that they or their traffickers utilized local or long-distance buses in the facilitation of their exploitation. We know that traffickers recruit victims at bus stops or out of bus terminals and utilize buses in transporting them, either following an initial online recruitment when they are using a bus to bring their victims to them, or using buses to take their victims to or from places where they'll be sold. And when victims are able to get out, a bus or bus station or bus terminal may be the first place they'll go to find safety or escape. And in those precious moments when they are so vulnerable to getting lured back, boarding a bus may be the only way they can get away. Now, the bus industry and transit certainly did not create this problem, but recognizing these points of intersection, it can play a significant role in helping to solve it. And the great news is that members of the bus industry are already stepping up and making a difference. Last year, a Lakefront Lines bus driver in Ohio was approached by a young woman on his bus who told him that she was being held against her will and forced into prostitution by a male passenger on the same bus. The driver, who had recently completed TAT's bus industry training, notified dispatch, and the Lakefront Line safety team immediately sprang into action and got law enforcement on the scene. As more details of their circumstances were revealed, the young woman was connected to resources and the alleged perpetrator was arrested. Now, this is TAT's work in action, and it's for moments like this that we launched Busing on the Lookout. We developed this program and industry-specific training materials specially designed for the bus industry, that's both commercial and school, because we recognize that bus drivers, terminal workers, maintenance staff, dispatch operators, ticket counter personnel, security guards are also on the front lines and see and hear things many of us do not, and therefore are uniquely positioned to provide an extra set of eyes and ears for law enforcement in recovering victims and arresting traffickers. The bottle training materials are primarily comprised of a 30-minute training video and an accompanying wallet card or app. The wallet card includes basic information about human trafficking, suggested questions to ask, red flags to look for, and what law enforcement needs when reporting a tip. It also includes the number to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Now that number, 888-3737-888, is a number that anyone in the United States can call to anonymously and confidentially report a tip or access victim services. And it's okay to be wrong. The hotline is staffed 24/7 with trained experts who are there waiting to take your call and can help you ascertain if you're indeed interacting with a potential human trafficking situation. Now, as a national organization, Bottles materials all include the national hotline number. However, as local transit agencies and community transportation providers, I do encourage you to establish relationships with your local human trafficking task force and law enforcement. And with your local law enforcement, encourage them to make sure they've also received specialized human trafficking training. These relationships and connections can be key to investigating and prosecuting a human trafficking case successfully. For example, not long after the San Diego Metropolitan Transit System rolled out its anti-human trafficking training program, which included the bottle video, and trained all of its employees, their transit security personnel took actions that resulted in the identification and arrest of a suspected trafficker. After observing a man at one of their transit centers acting aggressively toward a young woman who was clearly uncomfortable with his actions, a transit compliance officer notified dispatch, took a photo, flagged him on their security camera system, and followed him from a distance outside to his car, where the transit officer was able to record the man's license plate number. When the same man later returned to the transit center and was seen approaching other young women, transit officers stopped to ask him for his transit fare, which, not surprisingly, he did not have. The transit officers shared their suspicions and the evidence that they had collected with the San Diego Human Trafficking Task Force, which coordinated with other law enforcement agencies in California. The investigation that they initiated based on those tips culminated in the arrest of that man at a motel near Los Angeles, where he and an accomplice were holding a young woman against her will. In addition to training key industry personnel, another way we're working with transit agencies and community transportation providers is to reach victims with life-saving information. According to data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, the top type of caller are community members, kind of broadly defined. But after that, it's actually victims themselves who are seeking assistance. Knowing that, combined with the various ways that buses and public transportation intersect with human trafficking, we worked with survivors to create a series of posters that use language and visuals that are intended to be eye-catching for victims to see and know they're not alone, and to know that there are resources out there to help them. These posters also contribute to general awareness about how vulnerable girls, boys, women, and men can get lured into trafficking situations. We have all of these available in English and Spanish in both horizontal and vertical orientation, so they can be hung in terminals, transit centers, at bus stops, or in the interior of transit buses. And we will share the designs with you free of charge, so you can print them to your own specs and hang them in areas under your jurisdiction. Now, we cannot do this work without tracking impact. We track impact through recording the number of drivers trained, getting data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and from all the companies and school districts and transit agencies who have been training and see this work in action. In 2019, we honored the bus driver and safety director from Lakefront Lines with our annual Harriet Tubman Award for actions they took getting a law enforcement on the scene that day when a young woman in Ohio told her bus driver that she was being held against her will and forced into prostitution. The Harriet Tubman Award comes with $2,500 in cash, and the awardee and a guest are treated to an all-expense paid weekend of festivities over Memorial Day weekend at the Indy 500, including tickets to the race and parade, courtesy of Protective Insurance. The award is presented at the Protective Insurance Annual Gala, and we are accepting nominations for the Harriet Tubman Award now through the end of April. If all of those events, the gala, the Indy 500, do in fact happen, then that will be part of the award package this year. But if not, we'll have to modify that depending on the state of the current pandemic and social distancing that we're living in right now. But regardless, in order for us to consider drivers and dispatch or ticket agents or other bus industry personnel for actions that may make them eligible for the Harriet Tubman Award, we have to know about it. So please, as you roll out this training, keep in touch, keep us updated, share feedback, share other ideas. Let us know how this program is having an impact. Now, the effectiveness of our work relies on our partners, from training to information sharing to using their leverage within their spheres of influence to provide financial contributions that make this work possible. We are grateful to our partners. So just want to stop and give a special thanks to our gold, platinum, diamond, and freedom driver level corporate sponsors. Because at the end of the day, what matters most is that we know these efforts are working. In the past 10 years, truckers have made 2,496 calls into the National Human Trafficking Hotline, leading to 663 likely cases of human trafficking involving 1,230 victims. Now, this is just one slice of the data pie. It doesn't include calls to 911, the local sheriff's office. It doesn't include calls made by members of the bus industry or transit providers. Now, these are numbers that the Human Trafficking Hotline has just recently started tracking. So I hope to have bus industry statistics sometime soon. But really, these efforts ultimately bring it back to this guy and the millions like him behind the wheels of trucks and buses all along America's highways. This is truck driver Kevin Kimmel. Now, please think back to the case example I provided at the beginning about the couple who was arrested in January of 2015 at that truck stop outside of Richmond, Virginia. The young woman who was in that RV with Laura Sorensen and Alder Hutza had been held against her will, tortured, starved, and forced by her traffickers to perform sex acts in exchange for money. When she finally received the medical assistance she needed, doctors said that had a call not been made that brought law enforcement to the scene that day, she likely would have died within the next few days. That call was made by professional truck driver Kevin Kimmel, who recognized something was off, something was wrong, and instead of turning a blind eye, he picked up the phone. And I'm pleased to say that Laura Sorensen and Alder Hutza are presently serving 40 and 41-year sentences in prison, and the young woman was able to be reunited with her family in Iowa. Now, most people, when they hear about how dark this problem is, want to do something to help. But not everyone is in a critical position to make an impact. As leaders in Virginia Transit, you are. So what can you do? First and foremost, be on the lookout and call the hotline to report suspicions. Train your drivers and other staff using our industry-specific training materials. And if you contract any of your services out, whether for drivers, security guards, janitorial staff, or if you operate out of any brick and mortar locations with vendors, please be sure to share this information with those companies and make sure they get trained as well. And as you roll out the training, please be sure as managers to inform your staff of any internal protocols on reporting and make sure that your feedback mechanisms are strong. Display the bottle materials where you can and keep in touch. We want you to celebrate your change makers. Please, put up our victim-centered posters in locations where victims or potential victims may see them and know there are resources out there to help them. Consider participating in TATS coalition builds. And while we don't have any scheduled in Virginia at the moment, I hope that we'll get something on the books in your area soon. These coalition builds are half-day events that bring together law enforcement with industry leaders in a particular area for training, discussion, networking, and to build sustainable local relationships to close loopholes to traffickers. I will certainly be in contact with Lisa and Jamie and Danny and the rest of the team at the Virginia Transit Association if and when we are able to schedule a coalition build in your area. And as I mentioned earlier, for transit providers especially, I always recommend that you complement the bottle training with making connection to the law enforcement or human trafficking task force in your area. As community members, the stronger your connections are to one another, the better prepared you'll be able to be to respond effectively as a cohesive team. And finally, spread the word. It's not just your colleagues. Take this message back to your dinner tables, schools, communities. Our children need to know who pimps are, what traffickers are, and they need to hear it from people that they trust. Now, this is my contact information. Please reach out to discuss your training rollout plans or to request training materials or posters. And if I forgot to mention this earlier, but it's still worth repeating, we make all of our materials available free of charge. And so what we're asking for is a little bit of your time in order to share this information, but otherwise, we're going to share with you these resources without you having to pay for it. It's part of the core part of our mission as a nonprofit organization to get this information out. And so we want to work with you to build these into your current systems as efficiently and effectively and as far-reaching as possible. So that concludes the end of the presentation portion of this webinar. I am now going to open it up for any questions or comments that you may have.
This is Jamie, and at this time we don't have any questions or comments. You all can continue to send them in if you have any, or feel free to contact Annie with her contact information on the screen, or contact VTA staff and we'll send your message on to Annie. And if there aren't any questions, I will turn it over to Danny.
Okay. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Annie, for a wonderful presentation and educating our folks on this important issue. And please, send us any materials, and we'll try to get them out to our members as well, those on the call and those who were unable to do it because of the current COVID-19 situation. And on that note, VTA is continuing to monitor governmental restrictions regarding group events due to the pandemic. But for now, we are still planning to hold our annual conference scheduled for late May in the 28th and 29th. We hope that you will plan to join us in Roanoke for our members on the call. And for those who are interested in award applications, we're changing the final date from March 30th to April 15th for submission. We will have additional information and presentations along with opportunities to network and socialize with your colleagues at our conference. Please visit vatransit.com for any more information. We'll continue to update you as we get information and advice from those in the medical field. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you to everyone who was able to join us, and again for Annie for presenting. And I hope you all have a good and very safe and healthy weekend. Goodbye.